This is Aeon history. Tonight, a chapter from how Romans survived the plague that almost ended the empire. Settle in. The light is low, the hour is long. In the late summer of the year 165, a sentry stood on the wall of Seleucia on the banks of the Tigris and breathed air that smelled of river mud, of wood smoke, and of something sweeter and worse beneath it. The lamplight in the streets below had grown thin, for fewer hands remained to fill the lamps with oil. Somewhere a dog barked and was not answered. The man pressed the back of his wrist to his forehead, found it warm, and told himself it was only the heat of the day still clinging to the stone. He could not have known that he stood at the edge of one of the gravest catastrophes the ancient world would ever record, and that the sickness already moving through his blood would, in the years to come, travel west along every road the legions had built. We do not know that sentry's name, and we never will. The sources do not preserve such people, but the disease they carried would become known to later ages as the Antonine Plague, named for the family of the emperors who reigned, while it raged, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus and his co-ruler Lucius Verus. It is among the first great pandemics in human history for which we possess a written, eyewitness medical account, and that account comes from a single remarkable man whose words we will return to again and again tonight. For now, it is enough to say that the air over the eastern frontier had begun to carry death, and that the death did not intend to stay in the east. To understand what the plague threatened, we must first understand what stood in its path. The Roman Empire in the middle of the 2nd century was, by most measures available to us, at the height of its strength and confidence. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing many centuries later, famously judged the age of the Antonines to be the period in human history during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. And while modern scholars treat that verdict with caution, the evidence does suggest a world of remarkable reach. Grain flowed from Egypt to Rome. Olive oil from Spain filled amphorae stamped at Monte Testaccio, the great mound of broken pottery that still rises in the city today. Roads bound the provinces together, and along those roads moved soldiers, merchants, tax collectors, pilgrims, and when the time came, contagion. The trouble had begun, as Roman troubles so often did, on a distant border. In the early 160s, a war had broken out with the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east, over the contested kingdom of Armenia. Lucius Verus was sent to oversee the campaign, though the actual fighting fell to capable generals beneath him, men such as Avidius Cassius. The Roman armies pushed deep into Mesopotamia, took the cities of Seleucia and Ctesiphon, and won what looked, on the surface, like a triumphant victory. But the soldiers who marched home in the year 166 brought with them something far heavier than plunder. The sources are consistent on this point. The pestilence broke out among the troops in the east and traveled westward with them, as though the disease itself had enlisted in the legions. The ancient writers reached, as ancient writers did, for the language of the gods. There survives a story, preserved in several later sources and treated by historians with appropriate skepticism, that a Roman soldier in Seleucia had pried open a sealed golden casket inside the temple of Apollo, and that from this opened vessel a tainted breath escaped to poison the world. We should be clear that this is legend and not history, a way of explaining, in the moral grammar of the time, a calamity that otherwise made no sense. The truth was almost certainly more ordinary and more terrible. A crowd of men, exhausted, malnourished, packed together in camps and on ships and along marching roads, offered the perfect conditions for an infectious disease to spread and to follow them home. What was the disease itself? Here we must speak carefully, for this is a question on which even the most learned scholars disagree, and the honest answer is that we cannot be entirely certain. The leading view, held by many historians and physicians who have studied the surviving descriptions, is that the Antonine Plague was an outbreak of smallpox, or of some closely related virus now altered or extinct. Others have proposed measles, or have argued that the ancient symptoms do not map cleanly onto any single modern illness. The evidence we have rests largely on the clinical observations of one physician, and so it is to him that we must now turn, for without his testimony we would be all but blind. His name was Galen of Pergamon, and he is one of the few figures from this catastrophe whose voice reaches us directly. Born in the great city of Pergamon, in what is now western Turkey, around the year 129, Galen had risen to become the most celebrated physician of his age, eventually serving the imperial court itself. He happened to be in Rome when the plague first reached the capital, and though by his own admission he left the city for a time, a decision later readers have not always judged kindly. he returned to attend the emperors and the army, and he wrote about what he saw. Because he described the disease in order to treat it, and not to moralize about it, his account carries a clinical precision rare in ancient literature. Galen recorded a fever that did not quickly break, accompanied by a dark rash that spread across the body, and in many cases by pustules that dried and crusted as the illness ran its course. He noted that the patient suffered from a roughness in the throat, from coughing, and frequently from diarrhea, sometimes black with blood, which he regarded as an especially grave sign. He observed that those whose stool turned black were the most likely to die, and that the eruption on the skin, when it scabbed and fell away, left the survivors marked. It is the combination of the spreading rash, the pustules, and the scarring of survivors that has led so many later physicians to suspect smallpox, for those features sit uneasily with most other ancient plagues. We should hold this identification, though, as the strongest of several possibilities rather than as settled fact. What Galen could describe he could not cure. The medicine of the 2nd century, for all its accumulated wisdom, had no concept of a virus, no microscope, no germ theory of disease. Physicians worked within the framework of the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and they believed that illness arose from an imbalance among these, often provoked by corrupted or miasmatic air. Treatments accordingly aimed at restoring balance: bloodletting, purges, careful regimens of diet and rest, and an array of compound medicines. Galen mentions remedies he believed helpful, including a famous theriac, a complex antidote of many ingredients. We have no reason to think any of it altered the course of the disease in the slightest. The body either fought off the infection or it did not, and the physician, however skilled, was largely a witness. It is worth pausing here in the quiet to picture what such an illness meant inside a single Roman household, for the great numbers we will come to can blur into abstraction. Imagine a modest home in a provincial town, and here we are reconstructing a typical scene rather than reporting a documented one, so let us be honest about that. The first sign might be a child grown listless, refusing food, complaining that the light from the small high window hurt the eyes. By the 2nd day, a fever, and the mother laying a cool damp cloth across the brow, the cloth warming almost as soon as it touched the skin. Then the rash, beginning perhaps on the face, the spots that the family would have learned to dread because the neighbors' children had shown them too. The smell of vinegar, used to clean and to ward off bad air, hanging in the close rooms. The waiting. We can say with confidence that scenes like this repeated themselves across the empire, because the demographic and documentary traces of the plague survive in a scattered but telling fashion. In Egypt, where the dry climate has preserved papyrus documents that perished everywhere else, we find tax records and administrative papers that point to sudden disruption. There are villages in the Fayum region, such as Saknapeu-Nisos and Koranis, where the surviving documents suggest a sharp fall in the number of tax-paying adults. In some readings, a decline of a fifth, a third, or more within a short span. Scholars debate the precise figures, and rightly so, because a single village's records can mislead, and because flight from the tax collector can look much like death in the ledgers. But the pattern, repeated across several sites, is difficult to explain by ordinary fluctuation alone. The disease moved along the arteries of the empire with grim efficiency, and those arteries were the very roads and sea lanes that had made Rome great. A merchant ship leaving Alexandria with grain might carry, among its crew, a man already incubating the illness, and when that ship reached Ostia, the great port at the mouth of the Tiber, the sickness stepped ashore into the most crowded city the Western world had yet built. Rome held perhaps 1 million people, packed into apartment blocks called insulae, drawing water from shared fountains, using shared latrines, breathing the same close air in the same narrow streets. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing much later, traced the spread of the pestilence from the borders of Persia all the way to the Rhine and to Gaul, a path that follows the roads and the legions with eerie precision. When the plague reached Rome itself, the mortality was severe enough to lodge in the city's memory for generations. The biographer who composed the life of Marcus Aurelius in the collection we call the Historia Augusta, a source we must handle with great care, for it is late, often unreliable, and sometimes openly invented, states that the dead were so numerous that the bodies were carried out on carts and wagons. The same source claims that at the height of the dying, as many as 2,000 people perished in Rome on a single day. We cannot verify that number, and we should not repeat it as fact, but even if it exaggerates, it preserves a real impression. That death came in such volume that the ordinary rituals of the city strained and, in places, broke. Consider what that meant for the texture of daily life. The Romans took their funerary customs with profound seriousness. To be buried properly, with the right rites, mattered enormously to how a person and a family understood their place in the order of things. A plague that killed faster than the living could threaten not only bodies, but the moral fabric that held the community together. We can imagine, and again, this is reconstruction grounded in what we know of Roman practice rather than a recorded scene. The smell of smoke from too many pyres, the columbaria filling, the professional undertakers, the libitinare, overwhelmed. The historian Cassius Dio, writing of a later outbreak in the early 3rd century that may have been a recurrence of the same disease, describes a mortality in Rome of up to 2,000 a day, and whether or not the figures are precise, they testify to a trauma that the city did not forget. The most consequential victim of the plague in terms of the empire's politics may have been the co-emperor himself. Lucius Verus died suddenly in the year 169, while traveling with Marcus Aurelius near Altinum in northern Italy. The sources attribute his death to a stroke or sudden seizure, but it has long been suspected that the pestilence, then raging, played its part. Whatever the precise cause, his death left Marcus Aurelius to face the gathering storm alone, a storm that was no longer only medical, for as the disease thinned the ranks of the army and the population, the pressures on the frontier began to mount. This is the part of the story that reveals why the plague mattered so profoundly, and why later writers spoke of an empire that almost ended. A pandemic does not strike a society in isolation. It strikes a society already balanced upon 1,000 delicate arrangements, and it knocks those arrangements askew. The Roman army depended on a steady supply of healthy recruits drawn from the provinces. The treasury depended on taxes paid by a populous, productive countryside. The grain supply that fed the capital and the troops depended on labor in the fields of Egypt and North Africa. When disease tore through the population, every one of these systems felt the strain at once, and they fed upon one another's weakness. Along the Danube, the pressure became war. In the years following the plague's arrival, Germanic peoples, among them the Marcomanni and the Quadi, crossed the frontier in force, and in one of the gravest moments of the crisis, they pushed all the way into northern Italy, besieging the city of Aquileia. For an enemy to reach Italian soil was a shock the empire had not suffered in living memory, and it is no accident that this incursion came precisely when the plague had hollowed out the legions and drained the manpower of the provinces. We should be cautious about drawing too neat a line of cause and effect, for the Germanic peoples had their own pressures and ambitions independent of Rome's misfortune. But the evidence suggests strongly that the weakening of the frontier garrisons by disease created an opening, and that the barbarian peoples, whatever their motives, stepped through it. Marcus Aurelius found himself fighting on two fronts that could not be seen with the same eyes, one against an enemy of flesh and iron, the other against an enemy of fever and rash. To raise armies for the Marcomannic wars, he was forced to extraordinary measures. The sources record that he enrolled slaves into the army, a step taken only in moments of true desperation, and that he recruited gladiators and even bandits and auxiliaries from beyond the borders. He sold imperial treasures in the Forum of Trajan to raise money rather than impose new taxes on an already devastated population, a gesture recorded in our sources, and one that, true or embellished, captures something real about the scale of the emergency and about how the emperor wished to be seen meeting it. It is here that we encounter the inner life of the man at the center of the storm, for Marcus Aurelius left behind a document unlike almost anything else from the ancient world. While campaigning on the northern frontier, amid the cold and the mud and the constant proximity of death, he composed a series of private philosophical reflections, written in Greek, that we now call the Meditations. He never intended them for publication. They were notes to himself, exercises in the Stoic discipline he had embraced. And in them we hear a man wrestling, day after day, with mortality on a scale that pressed in from every direction. The Meditations do not name the plague directly in any detailed way, and we must not pretend that every line was written with the pestilence in mind. But the preoccupation with death runs through the whole work like a dark thread, and it is hard to read certain passages without sensing the shadow of the dying around him. He reminds himself, again and again, that death is natural, that it comes to all, that the great and the humble alike are swept away and forgotten. He writes of how whole cities, whole generations have vanished, and asks himself to look upon his own end with the same calm acceptance. In one striking passage, he observes that the plague around a person can corrupt the air and harm the body, but that a corruption of the mind and character is a far worse pestilence, turning the literal disease into a meditation on moral integrity. We cannot know precisely how Marcus Aurelius experienced the epidemic in his own person, but the philosophy he practiced gives us a window into how a thoughtful Roman of the governing class might have tried to face it. Stoicism taught that one should distinguish between what lies within one's power and what does not, accepting the latter with equanimity. A plague was the supreme test of such a teaching, for it was the very definition of the uncontrollable, striking the just and the unjust, the careful and the careless, without regard to merit. That a man bearing the whole weight of the empire turned, in such a moment, not to despair and not to cruelty, but to the quiet discipline of self-examination, is one of the more remarkable facts to survive from the entire episode. The ordinary people of the empire, who left no meditations behind, turned where ordinary people have so often turned in the face of incomprehensible suffering, to the gods. The plague provoked a great wave of religious activity across the Roman world, and the archaeological and epigraphic record preserves its traces in stone. Inscriptions and oracular texts from the period point to widespread appeals to the god Apollo, who in his aspect as Apollo Medicus, the healer and Apollo who could both send and avert plague, was the natural divine recourse. There survives evidence of an oracle, associated with the shrine of Apollo at Claros in Asia Minor, that was consulted by city after city, and that prescribed rituals and the setting up of protective images to ward off the pestilence. In a number of cities across the eastern provinces, archaeologists and epigraphers have found inscriptions that appear to record these very prescriptions, instructions to honor the gods, to perform purifications, to erect statues of Apollo at the city gates as a kind of spiritual quarantine against the entering sickness. We should be careful not to assume that every such inscription belongs to this exact plague, for the dating is not always certain, and protective rituals were a constant feature of ancient life. But the cluster of such evidence in the later 2nd century suggests a population reaching, in genuine fear, for whatever defense the divine order might offer. The smell of incense and burnt offerings would have hung over many a city square in those years, mingling with the sharper sense of sickness and of grief. There is a haunting figure who allows us to glimpse the religious response from the inside, alias Aristides, a celebrated orator and chronic invalid who lived through these years, and who left behind a strange and intimate work called the Sacred Tales, recording his lifelong relationship with the healing god Asclepius. Aristides describes falling ill during what appears to be the Great Pestilence, describes the sickness sweeping through his household and his servants, and attributes his own survival to the direct intervention and instructions of the god, received in dreams. We must read him as the deeply subjective document he is, the testimony of a man convinced of his own special relationship with the divine. And yet his account preserves something invaluable, the lived terror of the plague reaching into one household, and the consoling, ordering power that faith offered to those it touched. For the Christians, a small but growing minority within the empire, the plague would later be remembered as a moment of both danger and opportunity, though the clearest testimony on this comes from a later epidemic. We should be precise, because the history is easy to muddle. The Antonine Plague of the later 2nd century is one event. A second great pandemic, the Plague of Cyprian, struck in the middle of the 3rd century, around the year 250, and it is from that later crisis that we have the vivid Christian accounts. The Bishop Cyprian of Carthage, for whom that plague is named, described its symptoms in grim detail, and Dionysius of Alexandria praised the Christians who tended the sick and buried the dead while others fled. Some historians have argued that the willingness of Christians to care for the ill, even at risk to themselves, won the new faith both survivors who felt gratitude and a reputation for courage. We must keep the two plagues distinct, even as we note that the pattern of disease, fear, and religious response repeated across the centuries. Let us return, then, to the 2nd century and to the long arc of the Antonine Plague itself, for one of its most sobering features is that it did not strike once and depart. The evidence suggests that it came in waves, receding and returning over a span of more than 2 decades, roughly from the middle of the 160s into the early 180s, with a particularly severe recurrence around the year 189, which Cassius Dio describes as the worst he had known. A society can brace itself for a single blow and recover. A society struck again and again, just as it begins to rebuild, faces a far crueler test, for each return finds it weaker, its reserves of people and grain and confidence already drawn down. The cumulative human cost of these waves is one of the great unanswerable questions of ancient history, and here, more than anywhere, we must be honest about the limits of our knowledge. Historians have proposed mortality figures ranging widely, some suggesting that the plague killed perhaps 2% of the empire's population, others arguing for figures as high as a tenth or even, at the upper and most disputed end, a quarter or more in the worst affected places. An empire of perhaps 60 to 70 million people might thus have lost millions of lives over the course of the epidemic. We cannot pin the number down, and anyone who offers a single confident figure is reaching beyond the evidence. What we can say is that the loss was vast enough to leave its mark in the tax records of Egypt, in the recruitment crises of the army, in the brick stamps and building inscriptions that grow scarcer for a time, and in the memory of the writers who lived through it. The economic traces are subtle but real, and scholars have worked patiently to read them. Studies of dated brick stamps from Rome and Central Italy suggest a dip in construction activity in the relevant decades, consistent with a shortage of labor and capital. The number of surviving dated inscriptions across the empire, the ordinary epigraphic chatter of dedications, gravestones, and public honors, appears to thin during these years, which some scholars interpret as a sign of disrupted civic life, though others caution that inscription habits changed for many reasons. There are hints in the evidence of rising wages for labor, which is what one would expect when a plague makes working hands scarce relative to the land and tasks that need them. None of these traces is conclusive on its own. Together, read with care, they sketch the picture of an economy that absorbed a heavy shock and was, for a time, knocked off its stride. Yet here is the heart of tonight's story, the answer to the question with which we began. How did the Romans survive a plague that did so much damage? For survive they did. The empire did not fall in the 2nd century. It endured the Antonine Plague, weathered the Marcomannic Wars, and continued for centuries more in the west and for far longer in the east. The survival was not the work of any single hero or any clever cure. It was rather the cumulative effect of a set of structures, decisions, and sheer endurance that, taken together, allowed a wounded society to hold itself upright. Part of the answer lies in the resilience of Roman institutions and infrastructure. The roads that had carried the disease also carried grain, troops, and orders, allowing the central government to move resources to where they were most desperately needed. The bureaucracy, however strained, continued to function. Taxes were still assessed, even if collections fell, and the machinery of administration did not simply collapse. The army, hollowed though it was rebuilt through the extraordinary recruitment measures we have already described, and Marcus Aurelius, for all the desperation of his methods, succeeded in stabilizing the Danube frontier before his death. The empire bent under the weight, and the bending itself, the capacity to improvise, to enroll slaves and gladiators, to sell the imperial silver, was a form of strength. Part of the answer lies in the nature of the disease itself, for epidemics, however terrible, tend to burn through a population, and then subside as the supply of those who have never been exposed shrinks, and as survivors acquire immunity. If the Antonine Plague was indeed smallpox or something like it, then those who lived through an infection would, in most cases, have been protected against it thereafter. And over time, a population builds up a layer of survivors who can no longer be touched by that particular illness. The disease did not vanish, and it returned in waves, but each generation that survived carried within its flesh a kind of hard-won defense that the first generation had lacked. The recovery was paid for in the bodies of the dead, and it was real. And part of the answer lies simply in the deep reserves of a very large and very old society. An empire of 60 million people, spread across 3 continents, with diverse climates and crops and communities, could lose millions and still possess the human and material capital to carry on. A village emptied by the plague could, over a generation, be repopulated by the children of those who survived and by migrants drawn from less affected regions. Fields left fallow could be brought back into cultivation. The sheer scale and redundancy of the Roman world, the very thing that had allowed the disease to spread so far, also gave it the depth to absorb the loss. There is a hard lesson in this, and the ancient sources in their way understood it, that survival at the level of the whole can coexist with annihilation at the level of the village, the household, the single child laid on the pyre. We should resist, though, any temptation to tell this as a simple tale of triumph, for the survival was not without lasting consequence, and historians have long argued over how deep those consequences ran. Some scholars, following the work of those who have studied the economic and demographic data most closely, have argued that the Antonine Plague marked a genuine turning point, that it ended the long expansion of the 2nd century and set the empire on a more troubled path, contributing in time to the political and economic crises of the 3rd century. Others have pushed back, arguing that the empire recovered more fully and more quickly than the gloomier accounts suggest, and that the disasters of the 3rd century had causes of their own that should not be loaded onto the plague. This is a live and unsettled debate, and an honest telling must leave it open. The evidence permits a range of readings, and the wise course is to hold them in tension rather than to force a verdict. What is not in dispute is that the men and women who lived through the plague experienced it as a catastrophe of the first order, and that their responses, medical, religious, philosophical, political, reveal a society thinking hard about how to endure the unendurable. Galen kept observing and writing, building a record that physicians would consult for more than 1,000 years afterward. The cities raised their statues of Apollo and consulted their oracles, ordering the chaos with ritual. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations by lamplight in the camps along the Danube, teaching himself to meet death without flinching. The anonymous farmers of the Fayum kept, for as long as they could, their tax rolls and their land. Each of these was, in its own way, an act of survival, a refusal to let the disease unmake the patterns by which life was understood. There is something worth dwelling on in the figure of Galen, returning to Rome after his absence to serve the emperors and the army, choosing to stand again in the presence of the disease he could describe but could not defeat. The medicine of his age was, by our standards, helpless against the virus, and yet the act of careful observation, of writing down what the fever did, and the rash, and the black stool, and which signs meant death and which meant recovery, was not nothing. It was the beginning of a way of meeting disease with attention rather than only with fear, with the patient gathering of knowledge that, many centuries and many plagues later, would at last bear fruit in the science that could end smallpox altogether. Galen could not have known that. He simply did the work in front of him, and the record survived. Picture one last time a scene we can reconstruct but never confirm, an evening in a town somewhere in the provinces, perhaps 2 or 3 years after the worst of the dying had passed. The pyres are cold now. A family that lost members to the plague sits at its evening meal, and the lamp is filled with oil again, because there are hands once more to fill it. The bread is on the table, the smell of it warm and ordinary in the small room. An older child bears the faint scars of the illness on the face, the marks that survivors carried, and the younger ones do not yet understand what those marks mean. Life has resumed its rhythm, not because anyone defeated the disease, but because life, at the level of the family and the field and the town, tends to resume when enough survive to carry it forward. This, in the end, is how the Romans survived the plague that contemporaries feared might end them. Not through a cure, for they had none. Not through a single act of genius or heroism, though there was endurance and intelligence in abundance. They survived through the depth and redundancy of a vast society, through institutions that bent without wholly breaking, through the slow biological mathematics of immunity bought with the lives of the dead, and through the stubborn human work of observing, praying, governing, recording, and going on. The empire that emerged was changed, perhaps weakened, certainly marked, and the debate over how deeply marked will continue among historians for as long as the question is asked. But it emerged. And the people who lived through it left us, in their scattered words and stones and tax rolls and the private notebook of an emperor, a testimony that still speaks across the centuries. A reminder that the great calamities of history are not abstractions of percentages and frontiers, but were lived, one fever at a time, in rooms lit by small lamps, by people who did not know whether they would survive and who, against the odds and at terrible cost, mostly did. The Tiber still ran past Rome when the worst had passed. The grain ships still came into Ostia. The roads still bound the provinces together, and along them now traveled, in place of the contagion, the ordinary traffic of a world that had refused to end. That is where we leave it for tonight. The lanterns are dimming. Sleep well, and we will meet in the next age.